Hello, my name is Jackson Reimer, and welcome to my presentation on examining nature trails in the Southeast through the lens of Mehta's Public Space Index. So this research was about evaluating the quality of nature trails using a modified version of Mehta's Public Space Index. And so initially I found it important to kind of conceptualize the different subsets of nature trails that I was visiting, because I was noticing that there were some key differences between each of the trails that I was visiting. So I initially tried to group them together based on these expectations of the subsets. And so that's what you see in figure 1. So initially I differentiated them based on public and private ownership, and then also on accessibility, so whether they were accessible or not. And I found that I was solely evaluating trails that were accessible. So they were both publicly and privately owned, but they had to be accessible. So in essence, I wasn't trespassing when I was visiting these trails. And then next you see that I differentiated them based on the presence of subspaces and cost of admission. And so based on that, it helped me kind of conceptualize some of the expectations for each of these different subsets of trails, as I called them, that I was visiting, and kind of grouped them into these categories. But ultimately, this research was about evaluating the quality of these trails using a modified version of Mehta's Public Space Index. And so Mehta's Public Space Index was initially designed to evaluate public squares, but I found it was useful in modifying just any public space. Ultimately, you just had to modify the variables, the weighting, to better evaluate that public space. And so ultimately, this Public Space Index is based on 5 dimensions. So inclusivity, comfort, meaningfulness, safety, and pleasurability. And so again, I evaluated variables within those dimensions to better evaluate nature trails. And so in the end, my modified version of the Public Space Index featured 44 variables under those 5 dimensions of the Public Space Index, in which I scored the trail from 0 to 3 on each of those variables. And so, for instance, one of those variables was perceived nuisance of bugs or wildlife. And so if, the trail had, a high degree of yellow flies, for instance, then I would score it poorly in that regard. And so I would give it a 0 in essence. And the trail would score poorly for that. So ultimately I did that for all the 44 variables under those 5 dimensions, but with each of those dimensions being weighted equally. So they didn't necessarily all have the same number of variables, but they were all weighted the same. So they all contributed equally to the overall score, and gave the trails an overall score out of 150. So that score was then divided by 150 and multiplied by 100, and that's what you see. So this scores in figure 2 are all out of 100, which is just to easier communicate the results, or just makes it easier to communicate the results. And so the highest scoring trail system that I visited was Gulf State Park trails in Gulf Shores, Alabama, and the lowest scoring was Mara State Park. And each of those trail systems is featured in their maps are featured as figures 4 and 5. And so Mara State Park is figure 4, and ultimately it scored poorly because a lack of subspaces, a lack of meaning, poor maintenance, but yeah, ultimately it just lacked meaning. So the trails somewhat just meandered through this wooded area. There wasn't a lot of context to the space, and there wasn't a high diversity of use. So contrasting that to the Gulf State Park trails, which is figure 5, trail system was expansive. It provided you with a high variety and density of subspaces, which supported a high diversity of use. And it had eco subspaces. So for instance, there was like a dune area and then a wooded area, and it just supported a high diversity of use, had a high degree of meaning. Signage was great, and ultimately that's why it scored so well. But going back to kind of differentiating the trails that I was seeing, I noticed that there were some key differences between different trails that I was visiting. So that ultimately led me to divide these trails into different subsets. And I found that there are 8 subsets of nature trails. So public university trails, garden trails, history trails, art trails, preserve trails, state park trails, national park trails, and city park trails. And so those different subsets brought with them different expectations, and which ultimately affected their scores differently. But on average, I found that there was not a statistically significant difference between any of those subsets. However, state park trails did score higher on average, and public university trails scored lower on average, which I mostly attribute the lower score of the public university trail to being that there was a small sample size within that subset. So other subsets were definitely visited more frequently. For instance, the city park trails and the state park trails. But moving on, so looking at the radar graphs, I was able to look at like trends within each of the dimensions within those subsets, which is valuable. So city park trails varied greatly on all the dimensions, whereas the state park trails in figure 7, you can see there's a really strong average for all of the dimensions, and they pretty much scored equally all around, which was also interesting. But if you look at figure 8, this is where I think some of the more key takeaways from these radar graphs can be found. So this is the garden trail subset. And so you can kind of see that the garden trails are somewhat skewed away from inclusivity and meaningfulness, which is an interesting observation. First, it perplexed me. Like I had no idea why this would be, but it made more sense as I was reviewing my trail notes. And ultimately, these garden trails do not support a diversity of use because often people aren't going there to run or bike. They're going there for leisure reasons. They go in to look at the flora and fauna. And again, so they don't support a diversity of use. They also generally cost money to attend or to be admitted. And so that also contributes to a lack of inclusivity. And they're also like, it's not like they're often gated as well, or at least most of the garden trails that I visited were like gated. So ultimately that like affects how you interact with that space though. So another key takeaway that I found after evaluating these trails was that signage was a really key factor in the overall quality of the trail systems. So what you see in figures 10 and 11 are two contrasting scenarios. So figure 10 shows a fork in which there is no signage, so I have no idea what path right or left takes me to. And then figure 11 shows you a very detailed sign about the trail at Cheaha State Park. It gives me the surface, the elevation change, slope, the length of the trail, and much more information, pretty much all the information that could be needed to decide whether or not I want to go on this trail. And ultimately, signage was influential because it provides landmarks. It's often associated with meaningfulness. In some cases, it provided safety by warning trail goers of the presence of dangerous wildlife. And as you can see in this detailed example, it provides just a lot of information about the trails, which can ultimately be, a safety factor for the trail goer. And so in conclusion, I visited 52 nature trails across 6 states, walking over 202 miles while evaluating these trails. And I found that there's a really high diversity of quality and purpose of trails. So trails support, high array or large array of uses. And ultimately, this modified version of Mehta's Public Space Index served as a valuable tool for evaluating these diversity of trails that I discovered. And ultimately, though, signage, as well as other factors such as amenities and trail construct, greatly influence the overall quality of trails. I just want to say thank you to the Kugelman Honors Program, the University of West Florida, as well as the Office of Undergraduate Admissions for supporting this research. I also want to thank my faculty mentor, Dr. Jocelyn Evans, for her continued support on this research, and also Clark Bailey for helping me evaluate these trails.